Commercial diving is exceptionally risky. What if you are deep underwater, connected to the surface only by an umbilical cord? If something goes wrong with this lifeline, the consequences can be dire. One such incident occurred with the Wild Rake ship operated by INF Fapco Diving Services. They were tasked with repairing an oil transfer station in the North Sea using their new diving vessel. Despite the ship still being finalized, it was hurried into service. Their mission was to reinstall a single anchor leg mooring, SALM, on an oil platform in the Thistle oil field. This equipment allows tankers to safely load oil away from the platform. During initial dives, they encountered unexpected issues with their saturation diving system. This system, which included a pressurized diving bell, allowed divers to work at deep ocean depths without undergoing lengthy decompression periods. Unlike recreational diving, where ascending too quickly can lead to decompression sickness, commercial diving systems, like the Wild Rakes, keep divers pressurized until safely resurfacing, mitigating such risks. Commercial divers, however, have to spend long periods at deep depths to complete their work. This presents a challenge for companies doing repairs or installations on the seafloor. The saturation diving system helps manage this by keeping divers under pressure for extended periods, but it's not without its risks. The saturation diving system enables divers to work under constant pressure for extended periods, avoiding lengthy decompression times. On the Wild Rake, divers spent up to 28 days in saturation, working in ships to complete repairs efficiently. Attached to 2 living chambers, the diving bell accommodated 6 divers. 2 would descend to work while the others ate and rested in cramped quarters, driven by the job's lucrative nature despite its risks. Teams monitored chamber conditions closely, with additional focus on the bell's operations. Working nearly 500 feet below the surface posed significant risks. Though the Wild Rake had successfully completed 29 dives by August 1979. During their 9th day of saturation, divers Richard Walker, Skip Gill, Len Dave Mitchell, Roger Palmer, and Dave Boyd were preparing to secure the SALM unit to the Thistle platform after relocating it. When the previous diving team exited saturation, they reported issues with the new chamber and bell used aboard the Wild Rake. During their 17 dives, the team encountered several challenges typical of a new vessel. One major problem was the bell's swivel connector being too long to fit into its launch and cradle. Brian Masterson, INF Fapco's owner, opted to temporarily resolve the issue by replacing the swivel with shackles, though this makeshift solution compromised the bell's operation. Despite these setbacks, the new team entered saturation confidently on August 7th at 11:00 p.m. Richard and Skip prepared for their bell shift, donning essential hot water suits to combat the North Sea's frigid temperatures. The umbilical supplied them with hot water, breathing gas, electricity, depth gauges, communications, and video capabilities. Equipped with a dual-door system, the bell allowed pressure adjustments to match the work depth, enabling safe access without flooding. Richard ventured into the dark waters at 11:40 p.m., performing tasks and using a video camera to relay visuals to the ship's dive superintendent. However, he soon noticed the bell was unnervingly close to the seabed, tilted at a precarious 45 degrees angle due to design flaws that lacked ground clearance support. During their operations, Richard noticed a critical issue. The bell, now sitting on the seabed, posed a major challenge due to its design. If it rested directly on the ocean floor, there would be no clearance to operate the hatch door effectively. Meanwhile, inside the bell, Skip worked to manage the escalating situation by adjusting the gas valve to increase pressure as icy water began seeping up the trunk. By 2:45 a.m., Richard relayed to the surface team that the lift wire connecting the bell had snapped. He quickly sealed the inner door and climbed back up the trunk. On board the ship, the bell team realized the gravity of the situation. The bell was now suspended solely by its umbilical cord, with no video feed or communication. Simultaneously, a separate issue emerged on deck. The umbilical was leaking hot water due to a previous design flaw. Weeks earlier, the hot water line within the umbilical had cracked, prompting a makeshift external fix that was now compromised by the sudden strain of the broken lift wire. Despite these challenges, the gas supply and depth gauges inside the bell remained operational. The bell's internal pressure indicated that both Richard and Skip were safely inside and had secured the door under increased pressure, stabilizing their immediate environment. Fortunately, emergency air tanks were also accessible within the bell. Typically, a diving ship would use a secondary bell recovery method in such scenarios. However, on Wild Rake, this backup plan had been disabled recently due to design oversights and operational challenges experienced in the rough North Sea conditions. However, the decision was made to remove the clump weight system, to clear the rail and launch the bell into the water. They had been using this method for weeks, but made no efforts to rectify this dangerous situation. Now that Richard and Skip were safely in the bell, without a lift wire or clump weight to bring them up, options were being discussed on how to recover the bell. Inside the bell, the men followed protocol, staying locked in and attempting to send messages. But they only heard static over the radio. The air and hot water were still flowing, so they knew they just needed to sit tight and wait for a recovery operation. Suddenly, they felt a jerking heave, then another. They couldn't believe it, but it was clear someone was trying to recover the bell using their most precious lifeline, the umbilical. Skip yelled into the comms, "Put us on the bottom! Put us on the bottom!" over and over. He had no idea if the message was getting through, but he was desperate to protect the only connection, keeping them alive. On the Wild Rake, Diving Superintendent Holmes faced intense pressure to recover the bell. With the clump weight unavailable, they had to rely on the umbilical, despite knowing the system wasn't designed for emergency recovery. Critical oversights in the bell's construction and operational limits became evident, exacerbated by previous failures due to substandard materials. Owner Brian Masterson joined Holmes in consulting dive experts to explore options. The safest plan involved lowering men to relieve pressure on the umbilical and requesting assistance from another ship to reattach a lift wire. At 2:57 a.m., they contacted the steno welder for standby assistance. Despite a safer alternative, they opted to try the umbilical. On deck, attempts to repair the hot water line were interrupted as they powered the hydraulic motor on the umbilical wheel. The attempt quickly turned disastrous. The umbilical strained, split open, and jammed, spewing hot water like a meat grinder. Instead of calling for immediate assistance, Masterson and Holmes persisted with the umbilical, using the ship's crane to lift the bell. Again, disaster struck as the umbilical further failed, snapping wires in twos. Inside the bell, Skip and Richard struggled with the loss of power and damaged systems, facing hypothermia without proper suits. The clock started ticking on their survival. At 4:00 a.m., the steno welder was finally asked to rescue Skip and Richard. The two ships exchanged instructions and equipment. Resolving issues by 5:45 a.m., steno welder divers Eddie Frank and Phil Casey prepared to connect the lift wire and reach the stranded divers. Originally, they planned to lift the bell themselves, but Brian Masterson insisted on using the Wild Rake's own wire for the rescue, despite objections from the welder's dive superintendent due to safety concerns. The welder's bell was deployed but took over an hour to locate because the Wild Rake crew had not updated the bell's coordinates after moving it from the SOM base earlier. The missing transponder, lost the previous night during deployment, further complicated matters. Instead of retrieving and reattaching it properly, the crew hastily cut it off, adding to the confusion. Compounding the problems, the steno welder had just repaired its own bell before the rescue call, leaving their lights and communications malfunctioning. This made locating and communicating with the stranded divers even more difficult and risky. At 6:44 a.m., Casey entered the water to find the bell. Over an hour later, he finally tapped on the window and saw Skip and Richard inside, signaling they were alive at 7:55 a.m. During the wait, Skip and Richard considered their last emergency option, releasing drop weights attached to the bell to ascend quickly. They knew the risks, having heard of recent deaths from accidental releases. Despite efforts to secure the weights with ropes, they were trapped on the seabed. Richard managed to release one weight but couldn't reach the other due to the bell's tilt and door hinges. By 7:50 a.m., they had secured themselves inside the bell, hoping for rescue. When Casey found them at 9:02 a.m., they were desperate but alive. With faulty equipment and rough seas complicating efforts, Casey struggled to connect the lift wire in darkness. By 10:10 a.m., he confirmed they were still hanging on. At 11:40 a.m., the attempt to lift the bell failed due to Masterson's decision to maneuver at a 45 degrees angle instead of repositioning properly. Crew disbelief grew as the bell snagged, prompting reckless tugging instead of careful assessment, a stark departure from standard diving practices. Their worst fears were confirmed when a loud boom and snap of the line caused it to go slack. It was 12:20, and the bell was lost again. Inside the bell, Richard and Skip must have known exactly what happened. It had been 8 hours since the bell had lost heat and 2 hours since someone had last peered through their window. They heard the metal clank of the wire being attached, and now the bell was finally moving. The overwhelming relief must have revived their hopes for rescue. But then the unthinkable. A loud clash of metal brought the bell to an abrupt stop. And then, after a moment, the thump of the wire breaking and the release of the bell back to the seabed. Richard and Skip were hypothermic, exhausted, and nearing death. Each breath was a chore to pull the cold air into their lungs. The men knew that it had taken hours of freezing silence waiting for that wire to be reattached the first time. The sinking realization that they just might not survive long enough to get the bell out of the water was crushing. The steno welder was asked again to locate the bell and check what had happened. Frank spent 30 minutes looking and finally found the Wild Rake's bell wedged tightly between a pipe and the SOM base. At 1 o'clock, he tapped on the porthole and saw the white face of Richard react. He was drawing hard breaths and slowly opened his eyes to see the face peering in at him. Skip was curled up in his blanket on the floor of the bell. Just as Frank had gotten a look, he was jerked away by his umbilical. The rough seas kept the steno welder fighting to stay in position, moving their bell and pulling the divers uncontrollably. At 3 o'clock, the steno welder divers were brought up to the surface after 9 hours in the water. A new diver was sent down to try to rehook the lift wire and get the Wild Rake men out of the water. It was 5 o'clock when he found the bell. He looked inside to find the men slumped over each other on the floor. Skip and Richard had been without hot water for over 13 hours. It wasn't until 7:30 that the bell was finally recovered and brought on board the Wild Rake. Despite a dozen individual heroic efforts to save the men, it would not be. They had survived with no hot water for at least 9 hours, an unbelievable feat of the human will to survive. As this event was analyzed over the next several years, the many reckless and impulsive choices were questioned by the professional diving community. Brian Masterson should not have been directing the rescue. There were many well-qualified men who knew the perils well and had plans established to retrieve a separated bell. His mistakes, compounded with others, cost these two men their lives. To add insult to injury, he was trying to get the umbilical replaced so that he could send the saturated divers down to complete the job. The 4 men that remained in saturation immediately demanded to start the decompression process, which would take them 5 days. Eventually, the company was sued in Scottish and United States courts, but they were able to evade any real consequences of these actions, like claiming that they were not the actual employer of the men. Later, in a UK court, 12 individuals were sued and settled with the divers' families for a small financial payout. The story of the Wild Rake underscores the dangers of commercial diving. How can we prevent such tragedies in the future? By prioritizing strict safety measures and supporting organizations that promote diving safety. Visit organizations like IMCA to learn more and help improve industry standards. Like, share, and subscribe to raise awareness and ensure safer diving conditions for all.